guys, welcome back to the Discipline Life Podcast, the place where we talk all about power differential relationships and domestic discipline. I'm Aria, and this is my husband, Coda.
Hello, everyone.
And on today's podcast, we are going to be delving into the discussion of dominance. What is dominance? What makes a man a dominant man? And what, the ideas that are out there, are they legitimate? Are they inclusive? Or are they flawed in some ways?
And this is what this is kind of doing is a little bit piggybacking on our last podcast, just a little bit.
Right, because I think
that discussion a little bit.
Yeah, because our discussion last week kind of veered into like the role of submission. So we kind of wanted to do a flip side and do the role of dominance.
Yeah, and see what that's all about. I think one of the things that we got a lot going on out there, especially as guys. I don't know what it's like for women, Arya. You may have to speak to this on a different podcast. But guys, there are many, many definitions that you see out there of what is dominance. Is it okay for a guy to be dominant? What does masculinity look like? Is it okay for a guy to be confident? Is it okay for him to be in charge, for lack of a better term? And then you see all these different things out there of toxic masculinity, or a man that may be more feminine and his wife takes more of a leadership type role in that relationship. And I think some people have even gone to the extreme and said, oh, that's a castrated man. He's been castrated because he has no say whatsoever. And so we wanted to talk about what are maybe some of those things out there that the world right now, that with all the information that you see, how does that look in a domestic discipline relationship? Is some of those things okay in a domestic discipline relationship, or are some of those things actually really bad and you should kind of steer away from those things? And how does that look within a relationship?
I can definitely say from the female perspective, especially more traditionally minded females, there are no lack of opinions that we come across as well. So that's definitely something that is universally shared.
I wonder if that's more than guys, just because
I don't know.
I'm just curious. I don't know for sure if that's the case, but
I mean, I would say probably, because I think a lot of sources that are telling guys like, oh, this is how you need to be an alpha male, be a Chad, they will then on the same podcast or on the same resource then tell women, this is what you need to do. And if you do that, and they have a lot of opinions for women too, where sources that are like more female driven, that are like, oh, this is how you be feminine. And they typically don't target men.
Right.
I mean, some do, but a lot don't.
Right.
Where most of the time your podcasts that, and I'm sure that our audience can kind of fill in the blanks. I'm not going to name names, but your podcasts that are out there saying like, this is how you need to, find a woman. This is what you need to do as a man. They will then say, women, you need to
do X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And so this, I think, like I said, it kind of stemmed out from last week's podcast, but then at the same time, we know that we get couples, and we definitely get guys that listen to this podcast in addition to women, and so what does that look like in a domestic discipline relationship? Well, I can only tell you what it looks like for our relationship, but I'm going to try to help expand. And Aria, as we go through this, feel free to jump in and tell me,
I mean,
your thoughts on something.
We can talk extensively about how dominance is presented in our relationship and your style of dominance, but I think it's important also to kind of touch on, and we will, on the different styles of dominance and how dominance is not a one size fits all, because people are unique, situations are unique.
Yeah.
However, there are some parameters of this is not the way to go, and on the other side of the pendulum swing, this is not dominant. And so we'll kind of touch on that too, to say, hey, if you're swinging too far one direction, then that's when you veer into, more of that, where people get the idea of toxic masculinity.
Right.
And then if you veer too far in the other way, well, then you lack leadership, and that's not dominant at all.
Well, so I'm going to just start with our relationship, and I'll bear a little bit of my past, a little bit for you all. And so I'll just start there. The way I was raised in a religious home, but it's very interesting. Just because you get raised in a religious home, a lot of people may assume automatically how certain things work. So for some of you may have already, he was raised in a religious home, therefore dad was always in charge, authoritarian. Not my situation. No, my dad did. It wasn't that he was lax on punishment, that we just got away with anything. That was not the case. But my mom definitely wore the pants in the house. And
I was going to add, from my outside perspective and hearing you talk about your childhood, your dad seemed to be a strong disciplinarian with you and your siblings.
Right.
But he didn't have that same leadership when it came. It was almost like your mom was the one directing him, like, you need to handle your kids.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I mean by
this situation.
Right.
It's not that your dad was lax at all.
No, but that's what I mean by she wore the pants, from the standpoint of she kind of directed, like, you need to talk to your son. You need to discipline your son. You need to X, Y, and Z on it. And part of that is that he owned his own business, and so he worked really, really hard to try and make a good life for us, but he had this business to run, and so it just was hard for him. And so I didn't grow up necessarily in where my mom was very, like, I wouldn't call my mom dominant in the relationship necessarily. There may have been some areas where she was, but I wouldn't say 100% of the time it was that way. But I also wouldn't say that my dad was 100% dominant. In fact, it was probably more like 60-40, 60% being my mom and 40% my dad, if not bigger margins.
Again, from an outside perspective, because when I married into your family, I remember it was the first year that we were married, and your mom very much is a carbon copy of her mom. And
sorry, I'm laughing because she's not lying when she tells you this.
And to paint a visual picture for our audience, that concept of just the henpecked husband, that is the style of wifery that your mom and your grandmother had. And so when we first got married, I remember, I forget what the situation was. I think it was like sending out Christmas cards.
Was it like thank you cards or something?
Thank you cards or something like that. And your grandma specifically, but your mom too, they came to me and was like, you need to make sure that he does X, Y, Z, and you need to remind him. And I just remember and this is like one of the only times that happened, because I'm like, hey, honey, you need to remember to do this. Okay, got it? And then I just looked at them.
You said that across the room, if I remember.
I did. Yeah, right. And I just looked at them like, okay, I reminded him. Like, I didn't think I did anything wrong, but because I was like, well, I'm not his mother. Yeah. I'm not going to go and just henpeck him to death until he finally does it out of exasperation.
Yeah, so when you say henpecking, another word would be nagging.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was definitely...
Henpecking was a nice word that they came up with in the 50s.
Yeah, right, exactly. But no, you say the truth. That's exactly what happened. That's kind of how their relationship was. She nagged my dad. She nagged us as kids. And so my idea of a relationship was that. And again, it wasn't that they were great parents. They were not abusive. They did their very, very best. But they were a typical sorry for any boomers that are listening. They were a typical baby boomer type family, and there were just certain ways that you did things, certain ways that things got done.
And that's not reflective of an entire generation.
No.
That's just reflective of where society was at that point.
Yeah,
And how
sure.
the vast majority of people ran their households in that society.
Look, I've dissed on my own generation on this podcast, the millennials,
Oh, yeah.
so I'm not worried about it. Like, I got plenty of things to say about my own generation that are messed up. But
just like our generation, obviously, we
Yeah.
have this relationship. I see a lot of representation on social media of 20-somethings and 30-somethings that are returning to these traditional values.
Yeah.
There definitely are exceptions in every
Sure.
generation. So
yeah, and so I don't want to rope everybody in. I just want to say that that's kind of the branch that they were coming from. And again, we were not abused, but we just saw a relationship that was very, very different. So when I got into the dating world, however you want to say, when I decided to start dating, this is going to sound awful, but I wanted an opposite relationship from my parents. I did not want that kind of a relationship at all. And I definitely didn't want a relationship like there were a couple of my buddies in high school where you want to talk about where it even went further, where mom wore the pants and you walked in and dad hardly said anything and he had his tail in between his legs sitting in the corner and he could come to dinner when mom said it was and he could talk when their mother said it was okay. And I was like, I definitely don't want that kind of relationship. However, I don't know if Aria would agree with this, but when we got into our relationship, even though I didn't necessarily want those things, and you weren't that kind of person, I still kind of defaulted to the way my dad was a little bit. Wouldn't you agree?
I would definitely say the first few years of our marriage was a little bit of a learning curve as far as like how we were going to function as a couple.
Right.
And I think that that's really true for most people that don't live together before they're married.
Yeah.
Is that you come together, you're in one household, and now you're trying to figure out how you are going to function as a couple.
Yeah.
Because I was not the type to just constantly remind you and hound you for things. I was like, he knows it needs to be done. Right. If he values it and it's something that he wants to do, he will do it in his time.
Right.
And so there were a lot of times where you dropped the ball on stuff. I don't know if it's because you forgot, because you really didn't value it, even though it needed to be done.
Depends on what it was, but it's a combination of both of those things. Yeah.
And it took you kind of reaping the natural consequences of dropping the ball on those things to realize, oh, I have to step up and do the things that need to be done or do the hard things and lead and drive the relationship because she's not going to.
Right. Right.
And in some ways I did lead, like I did have that,
sure.
More typical presentation just because I grew up with a single mom for the majority of my childhood. And so where I struggled was, I can't count on anyone else. I need to make sure that if it's really important that I do it and I get it done.
Right.
And so
So you didn't nag, you just did it.
Right. And so my journey has been to step back and let you lead and take that back seat.
Right.
And really, yield to your leadership.
Yeah.
That's been my journey, where your journey has been stepping up.
Yeah, and so as we've gone on in our relationship, it has been where my challenge has been, and maybe many of you listening right now, this has been your challenge, the men, It's been hard for me to step up. It has been hard for me, Arya, I can tell you, especially when we first started, to really hold her accountable to the rules. You've heard several times on this podcast where she said you could afford to be a little bit stricter. I'm slowly turning into being a little bit more strict, but it's still a challenge for me because I still equate sometimes, not all the time, and this comes from my childhood, I still equate being strict as being mean, as being authoritarian. And what I've realized is that's not necessarily the case.
Well, because in all fairness, the leaders that you had in your life, your dad, teachers, different people that you had in your life, the ones that were kind and gracious and let you develop kind of at a more appropriate pace, they were all very passive.
Yes, they were. Yeah, they were not what we're talking about here.
And the leaders that kind of demanded growth from you were very authoritarian and very
abusive, some of them.
Right. Yeah. And so in your defense, your only examples are, okay, kind, caring, gracious equals passive. Authoritarian, unreasonable, and driving equals borderline or not so borderline abusive.
Right. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So that brings us around to, okay, so the struggle then has been, staying away from the extremes. We don't want this, and I don't like this term, but I'm going to use it because it kind of relates here. A toxic masculinity. The reason I don't like that term is I think it's thrown around too much for certain things, but it applies in this area. So what's the balance between toxic masculinity and then way over here, the passive, apologizing for being a guy, passivity over here? And so in our relationship, that's the balance that I believe we're looking for, and I think a healthy domestic discipline relationship has. You're gonna interject.
I was. I don't know. I don't want to rabbit hole too much, but I heard somebody online, and I don't remember where I saw it or where I heard it. So
it wasn't on our comments.
No, okay, not good. At all. This was on an Instagram account somewhere, but like I said, I can't reference back to it because I don't remember, but it lives in my brain. Where they were saying that what is presented as toxic masculinity is actually men who have not been given the liberty to be masculine, and it's a retaliation of being like, kind of like cornering a wild animal, right?
Right.
Where they feel like they are being stripped of their leadership, stripped of their natural masculinity. And so toxic masculinity is really just a lashing out of that.
Yeah, of that. Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. So in our relationship, I obviously, you guys know from this, I have the dominant role in our relationship.
You do?
I better. And we have been on this journey. We're still on the journey of making it to where I, for lack of a better term, I'm in charge. That doesn't mean, again, that like we talked about last week, that Arya is the doormat and I crack the whip, and if she doesn't do what I tell her to do, then she has a certain amount of lashes with the cat of nine tails and all that kind of thing. That's not how that is. But we have obviously come to the conclusion, which is why we do this podcast, that our relationship and our family functions better when I am the dominant, or I am the leader of the family, and she submits to my leadership, and therefore our child then submits to her, and we have this, for lack of a better term, a hierarchy this way. And so I must find, for all of you guys out there, the thing that you have to wrestle with constantly, but it's an important thing to wrestle with, to work really hard to find, is when are the moments that you need to be gracious and kind and loving in certain situations, and when are the times that you need to be strict and you need to lay down the rules and you need to say, look, I know you don't like what's happening, but this is what needs to happen, whether you like it or not, and you need to trust me, and you will find out in the end that I was right. And it's going to be uncomfortable right now, but in the end, it will produce exactly what we're wanting to produce. That is a hard thing to find because, again, if you don't try to go through that process constantly, which I'm constantly asking myself, okay, in this next thing, whatever it is, how do I handle whatever situation comes up? Because you don't want to go to either side. You don't want to be too lenient because the way the relationship works, Arya needs me at times to be a little tough on her, needs me to say, no, we're not doing that. I don't like that. Or, hey, you're teetering on this border of getting a punishment because of X, Y, and Z. At the same time, she doesn't need me to walk in, start barking orders and going, how come you didn't get this done? And how come you didn't do that? And why isn't this done? And start hounding her because XYZ maybe didn't get done because she had to deal with our kid, preteen, all day long with something because she homeschools. You have to be constantly asking, okay, if this, and I'll do scenarios in my head that are not even happening. So one of the things I'll do is I'll say, okay, if this scenario presented itself, how would I handle it? If this scenario presented itself, how would I handle it? Because if that scenario does, in fact, present itself, I want to be ready. I don't want to be caught off guard. And so one of the things that I would challenge you all to do is think about those things. I've even, I can't remember where I heard this. It wasn't a podcast or something. But I heard a scenario where there was a couple that intentionally would have like these written on cards. And they'd go, okay, here's the scenario because she wanted to know how he would react to a scenario. And I can't remember where I saw this now or heard this.
I've never heard of that before. That's a very interesting
right,
concept.
it's really interesting how to do it. And if I guess, if that's something that would help some of you listening, go for it. It'd be really funny for our relationship. But I do that in my own mind so that hopefully I can tackle scenarios like that. But a lot of this is in order to be not passive or have this passivity and be, but also not to have the toxic masculinity. You've got to constantly be working on how yourself and how you're going to handle situations and trying to get rid of bad habits that are detrimental to the relationship. So I'm constantly trying to get rid of the bad habits of saying, because there are times I want to be strict on Arya, but it's uncomfortable for me. And believe it or not, just like it makes her uncomfortable sometimes, that makes me uncomfortable, and I have to learn to be comfortable with the uncomfortable feeling, if that made any sense at all. And so what was said by one of my mentors of mine is he says, you have to get comfortable standing in lava. You just have to learn to be comfortable standing in lava, and you have to learn how to do that. And if you can do that, then you can handle certain, and there's situations I'm getting better at. There are a lot of situations, and Arya will tell you early in our relationship, boy, I wanted to run from those. I ran from some situations where I would procrastinate in certain areas because I'm like, I don't want to make that phone call, or I don't want to talk to so-and-so because I don't want to have to deal with this problem. And what I realized is it worried me. It caused me issues. And so now there's a lot of scenarios where I'm like, I don't care how comfortable it is. We're handling this right now. And we're going to have major surgery right now so that I can get a solution and move on. Yeah, wouldn't you say that's
definitely.
A lot of things that happened.
I think you've grown a lot in that area. And I think what it really comes down to is passive leadership is the absence of leadership.
Yeah, that's very good. That's very good. Somebody tweet that if somebody's got a Twitter. So yeah, that's the absence of leadership. And just think about it. again, I love the analogy, so I'm bringing up a sports analogy, but I can't because this is kind of my podcast today. No, I'm just kidding. But a passive coach doesn't last very long in sports. The coach that is authoritarian doesn't necessarily last long in sports either, because some of the franchises who have had these authoritarian coaches where they've got fired because the team quits playing for them because they're tired of getting hounded. But the same is true about a coach that just gets run over by their players. You have to have that balance of authoritarianism and being able to step back and go, okay, this is a scenario where I need to back off a little bit and let them play the game a little bit.
I think what it comes down to is that everyone needs a certain amount of leadership. Relationships need leadership. Women need leadership. And if their husbands or their man in their life does not give them that leadership, they will assume that role, because what do we do as women most of the time? We see a need and we fill it. And so if we see that what our relationship needs is leadership, we will assume that role.
Yeah.
But women come at leadership in a completely different way than men.
Right.
And I would say that male leadership is superior to female leadership in most scenarios. And because women come to leadership, number one, being able to justify everything we do. So if it was up to me, I would never hold myself accountable to the things that I do in our relationship in the way that you are able to hold me accountable.
Right.
Because I can justify all of my own actions, where when you hold me accountable, you are also introspective to say, this is where I failed and this is where I need to grow. I wouldn't do that.
Right.
On the flip side. And also women are more just emotionally driven. So I would see a situation, for instance, I'd be like, we are headed towards a cliff. We need to veer right. We need to get out of here. Where you may see, yeah, we're headed towards this cliff, but there's a bridge and we need to get to the other side and we're going to be okay. And where women just see the situation right in front of them and they try to make decisions based on that. And so, but if you have a guy that's really passive and he lacks any leadership at all, women will happily take up that mantle.
That's right.
And so really, the only way for men to regain a sense of true masculinity, a sense of leadership, is to begin to lead in productive ways that both honor his masculinity, his leadership, but also honor the woman and honor her need for leadership. And it's all driven by a genuine care and love for the other person.
That's the key right there. There's the key.
Because I think what we see in these podcasts where it's like, women need this and the alpha male Chad advice out there is that they don't come at it from a place of, this is a woman that you are in a relationship with, that you love and care and want to build a life with. It almost comes at it from the perspective of, a woman is a piece of property. She's an asset. She is a vehicle of pleasure. She is, providing some form of service.
Right.
And while not all of those things, while some of those things can be true, sometimes, ultimately, this is someone that you want, at least when you are in a traditionally minded relationship, and especially when you get married, this should be someone that you can build a life with and that you love. Coda and I got married when we were in our early 20s. I think I was 21, you were 24.
I was 23.
23. Okay. Yeah, it was right before your birthday.
Yeah.
And so we
were young.
We were young and we weren't necessarily thinking of this, but ultimately, when we got married, we said, this is someone that I am going to come together with, build a life with. And this is somebody that when we are 80 years old and, have mobility issues or have, no hair, this is still someone that I want by my side, because things come and go in relationships, but you need to make sure that you are building something on a solid foundation that's going to last. And that solid foundation is strong leadership, the masculine being in the proper presentation and the feminine being in the proper presentation. And when those things come together, that's what builds relationships. And there's not any one real right way to come together in that way. There are different styles of leadership. There's different styles of masculinity, and there's different styles of feminine energy. And so those are very unique to relationships. However, you really need to, when you are a man and you're looking at your leadership style and you're looking at how you present yourself in a masculine way, you need to tailor that to your wife, because that is the person that it matters to.
There's the key also, is that what works for Ari and I's relationship and the way that I do things is very much geared towards who she is. If I was in a different relationship with a different woman, that sounds really weird. Anyway, some of the things would probably change. And not probably. It would definitely change because it wouldn't work. Because I know it's a shock, guys. No two women are alike, just like no two guys are alike. Okay, so it's again, and I'm glad you pointed that out earlier. When they try to put women in a box, a lot of times these toxic masculinity guys, and just go, "Here's the one size fits all woman," and it's just like, well, no, there's traditional wives all over the place, but not all of them necessarily go about it the same way. They both do, clean the house, all these different things, but they're not necessarily going about it the exact same way.
Well, and I was just going to say, if you look at the guys giving that advice, they're all surrounded by young, this is all subjective, but like young, beautiful women, but they're all the same type of woman. And you can see that, like, their advice is attracting a certain type of woman, but it's all the same type of woman. So you have to decide, like, do you want, and to me, it's not a woman that's going to last. And maybe that's not what they're looking for. That's definitely not what their advice reflects. In my opinion, their advice is how to get what you want out of a young, hot woman, not how to find a wife that you can build a sustainable, long-lasting relationship with.
Exactly. So, like, when I'm old and have no teeth, that's what I wanted to know, if she would still love me.
And so, for us, you would not be a good fit for someone who maybe grew up in the country and had a small homestead growing like that. That's not the type of wife that you could lead, because you're not a cowboy. You're not a blue collar man.
I wish I was, but I'm not. I'm the furthest thing from that.
But I wouldn't be able to have that as my husband either.
Right,
like I wouldn't be able to have a man who's either, working a ranch or doing some sort of like public service. I have always said, like, I have admiration for military wives because I don't completely understand, but I can have some understanding of the sacrifice and the strength that it takes on their part to have a husband who is in the military, gets deployed, and that sort of thing. That is not a life that I would choose, because I don't see myself as being able to handle that.
Which is why you didn't want to marry a military man.
Right, exactly. And so, but on the flip side, your profession requires things that some other women may not
It's very true.
want to do.
It's very true.
You know, we move a lot. We don't have
Really? We've moved a lot?
At this point in our marriage, we've been married for 15 years. You have never had long-term job security.
Unfortunately, no, never have.
And so
trying to get it, but haven't had that.
But that's something that, you know, takes a certain type of person to be able to handle.
Yeah.
All that to say, I feel like I'm rabbit holing. All that to say, relationships are unique and leadership styles are unique. But that doesn't mean that you should be listening to these alpha male Chad podcasts where they try to, like, you know, you need to. I heard one, and it was kind of floating around social media where it's like, you know, if you want to be an alpha male, you don't get married before you're 35 and have a 6-figure income, and, you know,
Jiminy Christmas.
Yeah. And
I'd have never gotten married then.
And you have to be hitting the gym, and you have to be in like optimal physical shape and all this stuff that's just and then it's like, don't have kids. And it's like just kind of ridiculous because that might be reflective of that person's values, but that's not necessarily a good thing to be inspiring younger people to do.
No. In fact...
Oh, yeah, and he said also that you have to have a body, as a man, you have to have a body count, and I'm sure our audience knows what that means, of 50 or more before you settle down.
Okay. I'm not going to chase that one, but, and Aria knows, I'm a big superhero fan. But one of the things that I think is bad that can come out of that is if every guy looks at the movie screen and thinks he has to look like Thor. And I'm not talking Thor in Endgame. I'm talking Thor pre-Endgame when he's all ripped. Chris Hemsworth, the way Chris Hemsworth has enough money to have a trainer and a weight person that keeps him in that shape so that he can continue to get movie roles. Okay, so what I'm saying is that's the physical side, but there are other areas too where you may be comparing yourself to something that's just not realistic. And you have to say to yourself, okay, I want to be healthy. I want to physically, mentally, all of these kind of things, and I want to be a good leader. But don't compare yourself to a Hollywood version of that. You need to, and this is where it's very, very important to know what your wife wants you to be. And we've had conversations. I am not going to say that I am the most out of shape guy in the world, but I'm also not ripped either. But it doesn't bother Aria. She wants me to be me, and she knows that I'm trying to be healthy, and I do the very, very, very best I can to keep myself in the best shape possible. But I also do my very best to not compare myself to other guys and work hard to be the best husband, the best father that I can to her and to our daughter, and to put a set of standards that I feel like are realistic standards, not the Hollywood version or the toxic masculinity version of what people on the internet or people in Hollywood think a man looks like.
Well,
and a dominant partner looks like.
Well, and even beyond that, your leadership is not a physical attribute.
No, you're right. But a lot of people, the reason I brought that up is a lot of people would equate that with that. You know?
Because whenever we've talked about what I need from you as my husband and what I need from you as far as leadership is concerned, none of that is physical.
No.
None of that is, you know, something that you can externally change.
No, but the lie is out there that that's what that is, though.
Right. And I mean, we're not going to get into like the merits of like finding a spouse and all of that.
No, we don't have time for that here.
Right.
Anyway.
I was like, because the fact of the matter is like looks matter to an extent, but it's not, you can look the part, you can be the ideal and be a total pushover.
Yeah, you can.
And have absolutely no leadership.
Yep.
Again,
and then the other side is true. Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't mean to be pigeonholing this.
Oh,
too
no,
much, but
no, absolutely.
The other side is true, where you can look like that and be a total jerk and just be manipulative and mean and cruel and domineering and all this kind of thing.
So all that to say, real quick, I know we're kind of getting a little further into the podcast now, but so we have obviously covered the parameters of like being passive, lacking leadership. That's obviously not what you want to do as a dominant husband, as a traditionally minded husband. You want to have leadership. You don't want to be completely passive. You don't want to leave your wife to her own devices.
No.
Because in order to follow you, she needs you to lead the way.
That's right.
On the other side of that, you don't want to be the alpha male Chad, total down the red pill rabbit hole guy, because you want to see your wife for the unique person that she is, and you want to value who she is and what she brings to your relationship, and you want to have a genuine care and love for her and not view her as an asset to be managed.
Like you said, don't view her as property.
Right.
Don't view her as that. Don't view her as, oh, she's just another one of my assets that I have.
Right. She's a vehicle for X, Y, and Z, whether that be...
You guys are... This is a team effort, but the team only works, as we said last time, with the head coach and the assistant coach working hard together. But be the head coach, and when the hard decisions have to be made, you make those decisions. But that doesn't mean you don't get input from your assistant coaches.
But that also doesn't mean that you may have a wife that needs more of a micromanaging style of leadership.
That's true too.
And that's okay as long as you are tailoring it to what she needs.
That's right.
You also might have a wife, and I feel like I fit into this a little bit more, that needs more of a caring leadership, more of, someone to give, for myself, kind of give me direction in a very caring and loving way. And so there's different styles, and you just tailor it to what your wife needs. You might have a wife that is very independent, and so your leadership can be a little more hands-off. Just be careful with that, because that's more of a delicate balance.
That is a very delicate balance.
But you may also realize that she's hyper independent because she hasn't been able to count on your leadership in the past. And so that's something that needs to be fixed.
Right.
And so you just have to kind of find what works in your relationship. And there's really it doesn't become wrong until you start to devalue her personhood.
And vice versa. The moment that you, as the dominant partner, as the husband, feel like you are losing control and you are being nagged and you are being, what did you call it, henpecked?
Yeah, henpecked.
Yeah, that's a problem too. That's the two sides of the coin. When you're getting an imbalance there where she is becoming the doormat and you are just belittling her and destroying her personhood, or the opposite has happened where she has just decided she needs to set you straight and mommy you and all those kind of things. That's not okay too.
I was about to say, you don't want her, and honestly, you can probably figure this out if you are observant enough, that if she is starting to cower and become more of that doormat and more of that, I don't have an opinion, it's whatever you want, I'll just do what I'm told, I don't want to upset you, I don't want to, that is a sign that you have become a little too domineering.
That's right.
And that you need to pull back and you need to find a better balance. And on the flip side, if she's hyper independent and either is lacking the ability to follow your lead, or she is becoming more dominant and driving the relationship, you need to, again, make an assessment and figure out a way to communicate and rectify that situation.
What I was going to say earlier about that was, I married Arya so that I could have a wife. I don't need another mom. I don't want to be mommied. I want to have a wife.
And you don't need a dictator.
That's right. And she married me because she wanted a husband, not a drill sergeant. Mm-hmm. That's not what she wants. And that's what your relationship should reflect. And I think if people really saw in our society a healthy husband, wife, dominant discipline, domestic discipline relationship, they would like it. They just haven't seen good, wholesome, functional relationships enough to accept it, because all we see in our world is extremes. So what I want to encourage you guys to, as we wrap this up, is let's start taking all the things that we're talking about and showing people what a healthy domestic discipline relationship looks like, because I actually think it can work, and it can work good for both partners. But you have to work at it, and you have to be willing to make mistakes, and you have to be willing to kind of continue to assemble the car as you go along. But extremes are always bad. They're always bad. So don't fall into either one of those categories. That's the warning for the week.
All right, guys, if you are listening to us on YouTube, please hit the like button if you liked this conversation. And if you are not already, please do consider subscribing if you want to get bonus content and connect with us more. There is a link to our Patreon page down below. And you are always welcome to email us. Our email is also listed down below. And
for the Patreon users, we'll see you in the post show.
Yep, we do a post show for our podcast now, exclusive on Patreon. So we'll see you there. Bye.